thank you. Sound test, is this good? Great. Actually, another part of my background is I spent some time as a systems analyst at IBM after my graduate work in psychophysiology. And actually the general systems theory project at University of Buffalo was my formation years. And also I was kind of the Forrest Gump of the alternative physics communities across the United States in the 80s and 90s. I was kind of adopted by Bucky Fuller, Marcel Vogel, Arthur Young, Bill Tiller, worked with Elizabeth Rauscher for 30 years. So I had the benefit of being adopted by all those. I was the whiz kid of that generation. And so I must return the gifts the universe has given to me by trying to express the core. And the core in this case, to me, I think I have a fun little job today. I haven't seen anyone here, except possibly Paul LaViolette actually, trying to say, well, what is the simple, clear physics of what is the pure principle behind vacuum coherence zero-point energy, the pure principle. And if we understood that, we could then tune and optimize and say why each of these devices work. And that's my passion here today, plus it's fun. And so here's my hypothesis, that fractal physics of charge distribution, and I'm going to describe fractal physics in terms of wave mechanics, is the key to vacuum coherence, zero-point technologies, and neg entropy, the opposite of entropy, neg entropy, self-organization. In general, all vacuum coherence technologies ultimately require fractal conjugate charge symmetries to implode the surrounding quote-unquote ether, which is a superfluid charge media to the point of neg entropy, self-organization. Hey, your physics professor really screwed up when he or she said the universe is condemned to entropy, chaos. Wrong. And we are here to show very practical examples of self-organization called neg entropy, for example, well measured in phase conjugate optics. And then we're here to say how to tune and optimize that if you understand the direct output is also almost always interchangeable as energy or propulsion, since the net energy gain is simply charge inertia, which defines both the source of energy and the source of propulsion. So the pure principle is what we're here to talk about. BreakthroughTechnologies.com, I founded with Roger Green. We have international conferences every year on breakthrough technologies and plasma technologies. And the last 3 years, they've all been sold out. You can find the 3 international conferences at fractalfield.com/2017, 18, and 19, and also at therify.net, our main plasma technology. And we have pictures, and we'll talk about that. So, what this lecture portends to be is a review of universal physics of the vacuum as a charged superfluid whose distribution efficiency of that charge, which incidentally defines what makes energy free energy, is distribution efficiency for that energy, which ultimately depends on fractal conjugation. We hope to describe what that means visually. Visual evidence of fractality is a key to gravity, hydrogen, alchemy, non-destructive charge collapse, are examples of implementation in various zero-point technologies, and we'll give some examples today. And we want to do an introduction to longitudinal EMF, incorrectly called scalar or torsional sometimes. The only mechanism of neg entropy over unity, gravity, and all action at a distance. For example, our Therify plasma technology is quite famous for successful action at a distance. Why zero-point energies always affect gravity, and why free energy is the wrong term, because you're connected to the gravitational grid. Why zero-point energy could never be understood in principle until first learning why objects fall to the ground. Your 4-year-old walked up to you and said, why do objects fall to the ground? And you have to admit, quite embarrassed, that Einstein didn't know. And I submit to you that until you do know, you cannot understand why any zero-point energy device works. So I'm here to fix that problem, right here, right now, today. Because the fractal symmetry source of the charge acceleration named the gravity is ultimately also the charge inertia measured as output energy. I give the classic example, as I believe it was Einstein who said, If you're going up in an elevator and you experience getting heavier, that gravity you felt due to acceleration, there's no experiment you could do to differentiate that from gravity itself. In other words, physicists are wrong when they say acceleration that's due to gravity. No, no, no. They should be saying the acceleration that is gravity. And we're going to try to explain what that means. How proving the fractal structure of hydrogen, and I have a new equation for hydrogen structure, proving it's fractal, reveals the very nature of zero-point energy. The 0 point, which is only and always Planck, is always only accessed by the compressive longitudinal EMF component, arriving efficiently only on the phase conjugate cone vortex down to Planck. And we will use hydrogen by equation as an example. So the conjugate, think fractal or conjugation recursive interference, the conjugate longitudinal EMF symmetry required for all true negentropic vacuum coherence, free energy, is the same which reduces radioactivity and moves living cells to rejuvenation / negentropy. Example, we're going to be talking about Bearden a lot today. He was clear that only that longitudinal wave is centripetal enough to affect the nucleus and to heal a living cell. And the symmetry of the arriving compressional longitudinal is what does that implosion. So, sip of water. Thinking clearly by pure principle, and that's my passion. I wish to think by pure principle here, the essence of the problem. The vacuum plenum, in the vacuum plenum, infinite energy is only free if charge circulation / charge distribution efficiency is fractal or conjugate, which means longitudinal embedding. The only source of quote-unquote free energy, 0 point energy, or vacuum coherence is this longitudinal embedded fractal grid. For example, Bearden's MEG is recursion implosion attempted in inductive capacitive tank circuit. Resonance inside the circuit, if it gets recursive, self-similar, it begins to implode, and that charge implosion by perfected embedding recursion is named 0 point energy. And we want to show by examples and measurement. So the vacuum is a superfluid, it's an ether, whose compression rarefaction is named charge. Yin and yang. It could not be simpler. But I disagree with one little part of that. I agree with earlier discussion that the vacuum is the plenum of that ether, but I'm suggesting that ether is in fact compressible, and under the right circumstances it conveys inertia, and that's what we're here to talk about. So when that charge, remember the compressible universal, there's only one stuff in the universe, the compressibility of the ether, whose compression and rarefaction we name plus and minus charge, okay? And when that charge rotates, it gyroscopically stores the inertia, which is the only definition and creator we've ever had for mass. So when somebody says mass to you, think the inertia generated by rotating charge. Giving birth to mass by charge rotating appropriately is a way of thinking, extending what Paul has just been saying about the fertility of gravity. I think we want to get there. I admire Paul's rigor in approaching this. And two, that charge rotation, which is spin rate, has a period of rotation which is the only definition of time that has ever existed. Why? Inertia of rotation acceleration affects time. So every time somebody says time to you, think simply spin rate. That's it. It is very simple, it's elegant, and it works. So space-time is not bent. I agree with Paul and Tesla, actually. No, space-time is not bent. The only thing that is bent by gravity, that acceleration of charge towards the center of symmetry, is the path curve of charge trajectory. That's what's bent. So obviously, if time is just spin rate, it's not this separate thing that can be separated from space. No, it's simply spin rate. So the reason your watch speeds up if you accelerate is simply because the translation of vorticity, it concentrates the spin rate. And we're going to describe how the translation of vorticity is the definition of how to make longitudinal waves, and thus 0 point energy. So spin rate or time only accelerates during acceleration due to conjugate translation of vorticity. Acceleration speeds up time only because it accelerates spin rate. Another thing I should be on that slide is to be very clear. in phase conjugate optics, the only place that time reversal has purportedly been measured, it's abundantly clear that the only thing they in fact measured was return to greater order. So in conventional physics, when they said they had time reversal, the only thing they ever mean is negentropy, a return to order. For example, you can time reverse rusted steel back to unrusted, but you cannot do the reverse. You could only move toward order. So when they say time reversal, they always mean negentropy, hence rejuvenation. And our phase conjugate plasma technology, Therify.net, commercially succeeding with rejuvenation in about 25 countries now, is proof of that. And we'll show you a picture. When electricity is simply a superfluid dynamic only. So I think we do have an answer to what electricity is. I'm an electrical engineer by training and not a physicist. So for me, the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I think electromagnetism is a perfect description for the universal wave mechanic. And I say the superfluid dynamic, which is the superfluid of charge, means that electric field theory is simply only fluid dynamics. For example, voltage is pressure. It's not like pressure. It's not a metaphor for pressure. Voltage is pressure. Tesla's word is tension. Amperage is simply flow rate. Very simple. That's more than a metaphor. It's the actual physics description of what voltage and amperage are. So voltage, pressure times amps flow equals watts, works done. So if you think in fluid dynamics theory, you can understand field theory ultimately in pure principle. When charge moves towards center, centripetally, remember physics, as far as I can see, physics has perhaps not the first clue of what makes anything centripetal, which was life-shaking trauma for Victor Schauberger. If physics has not a clue to what makes anything centripetal, like electronegativity or gravity, and remember that focused human attention has many times been measured, causing electric fields to compress. Bill Tiller's work will show the book. So obviously, things that are centripetal are the essence of the problem. Gravity, mindfulness, and centripetal force and negentropy. So if you don't know what makes anything centripetal, I suggest you've got a problem. So when charge flows in towards the center centripetally, which is electronegativity and gravity and mindfulness, for example, why Montgomery got a little scared when he realized he could talk to his plasma. I'm telling you that unless you understand why and what allows you to talk to that plasma, you don't deserve to be working with it. For example, why ball lightning is so famously responding to telepathy. Living plasma is self-aware, and we need to understand exactly why, and that's why I'm here. So charge flows towards center centripetally, electronegativity and gravity, only are centripetal because of the path of charge out through the Planck threshold at the center by longitudinal conjugation accelerated through the speed of light. For example, Professor Raymond Chow, perhaps the most famous physicist, measured in faster than light velocities, always says, my measurements of faster than light are always between 1.5 and 1.7 times c. What's right at the center there? 1.618. When it is proven that 1.618 times c is the most commonly measured faster than light velocity, then my theory of gravity will be proven. Tesla doesn't work as superluminal. Wonderful, thank you. There's a lot I don't know about Tesla, thank you. Hence, the solution to Einstein's nightmare, not Einstein's dilemma, that he could never know why objects fall to the ground until he described infinite non-destructive compression of charge. Oh, I misspelled infinite, excuse me, infinite, well, you can flip it. So, infinite non-destructive compression is what we're presenting the solution to right now. That the implosive conjugate compression through center allows the charge to emerge at Planck threshold through the speed of light into longitudinal EMF. That is what a gravity wave is. Remember, bookful equations that longitudinal EMF is gravity waves, right here, Tom Bearden. So what was the valve that let charge out at the center that permitted charge to accelerate towards center, sometimes called the gravity. What was that valve that released that charge at the center? And that was phase conjugation through the speed of light at the Planck threshold. And we have pictures in a moment. It's a perfect vortex cone. So acceleration due to gravity is the wrong term. The acceleration of charge is the gravity. Summary. Fractality perfected, is recursion perfected, is embedding perfected, is self-similarity perfected, is compression perfected, is implosion perfected, is entanglement perfected. When you talk to these physicists and you say, well, we just measure something faster than light, they say, oh, that's entanglement. That's what they call it. That's the latest sexy term. But what is entanglement perfected? It's called embedding, nesting, conjugation. It's the same word, same concept. And that's phase conjugation perfected, that's nesting perfected. And that is vacuum coherence perfected. And that is the centripetal force acceleration, which is gravity produced and zero-point energy accessed. And that is what we want to prove by experiment we can perfect. And I'm going to show you 3 or 4 devices today, zero-point energy devices, that we can perfect by using my new equation for phase conjugation. The only 0 point is Planck. The only omega point. It's where transverse electromagnetic inertia is converted non-destructively to longitudinal compressional EMF, which are the only mechanism of gravity waves, superluminal fast of light, by golden ratio phase conjugation, and the only mechanism of action at a distance. Example, the earlier speaker, the caduceus antenna that he demonstrated making that beam, you know what that caduceus was? That was phase conjugation making a longitudinal EMF. It's obvious. And we know precisely how to correct and tune that caduceus spiral on that antenna. And actually, we're going to get back to circularly polarized longitudinal RF antenna when we describe the Kansas hydrogen hydrolysis solution. Or, for example, Ingo Swann so famously repeatedly heats this thermistor at a distance with his mind, lights a flame with his mind in the lab repeatedly through a Faraday cage. We know exactly what that was, the longitudinal wave generated, and we know the brain wave power spectra to teach that. Named flameinmind.com, precisely after Ingo Swann. So sacred space, or fertility perfected, is merely the longitudinal conjugate wave node where charge circulation and the only quote-unquote free energy exists, and centripetal force. And it's perfected by this mathematics of phase conjugation making longitudinal waves compressional symmetrically. So save the airline ticket and the pollution, make your sacred space. And we're going to show you 3 ways to measure it. flameinmind.com/lifeforce. Example, Korotkov follows a Kogi to their sacred space where they make phone calls to ancestors, measures the fractality of the air, and sure enough, it's charge compression. It is charge distribution perfected. And that's sacred space, and that's how you predict by measurement which building will cause a seed to grow, hint, dielectric constant of biological materials, and thus determine which architect should get a paycheck. Example, Bruce Cathy, harmonic 33, measures nuclear critical mass is dramatically reduced at the longitudinal wave nodes. For the same reason, the implosive capacitance, named the Ark of the Covenant, as a conjugate structure, original function was to non-destructively contain radioactive materials. The Anunnaki were such klutzes, they couldn't get through the Van Allen belt without nuking their way through. Longitudinal scalar EMF, that's the... See, I originally made this presentation to an international group of optometrist scientists. Some of these slides are from there, attempting to prove that the wave nature of mind and consciousness is also the solution to zero-point energy and fusion. So if you understand the electrical cause of mind, self-organization in plasma, if you will, at the same time you understand the implosive solution to zero-point energy and fusion. So that's what a lot of these slides are from that lecture. It's a fairly famous lecture. And actually they featured me on the cover of their magazine, the Optometrist Association. It's kind of fun. So the perfect flame is a fire that does not consume. I mean, that's classic spiritual wisdom. But now we know what makes it non-consuming, non-destructive compression of phase conjugation. Perfect implosive compression generates no heat. So now we have the answer to Peter Lindemann's little challenge. Okay, Schauberger's vortex just began spontaneously getting colder just the moment before it started making electricity from gravity. It worked so good, Hitler wrote him a check. And our plasma tubes, therapy.net, spontaneously get colder at the tip. What is the thermodynamics? It is clear that when the waves conjugate through the center of that tip, they negentropically self-organize and they condition the space around it, and they cause all of the waves to enter into phase because of the centripetal force of that conjugate wave node. Simple visual picture where pine cones kiss noses at Planck. So that's where you get that self-organization quality, and I'll show you some example from Jonathan and Dali's implosion research lab in Plymouth, UK, where I was, when they were cleaning up pollution, but in a moment. So perfect fusion is a self-organization, natural centripetal plasma. But in order to have the conversation, are the animations going to actually play? I mean, that would be fun. Well, they kind of do. Oh, yeah, there goes one. Okay, no. Transverse EMF, the electric field goes up and down. All of your radio, all the communications technology, and all of the billion-dollar physics labs owned by the military, almost all of them can only measure and interact with transverse electromagnetic fields. And most of those people do not know that there's such a thing as a longitudinal electromagnetic actually exists, which is a compressional wave, incorrectly called scalar or torsional. The reason it's called torsional is because a spiral antenna called circularly polarized can enable RF propagation to become longitudinal. And this is the only way to heal something electromagnetically. So sound waves work like this, but the electromagnetic waves we conventionally deal with, we only use that part of it. Now it's just like on the ocean. All waves have some longitudinal and some transverse component. But if you get most of the inertia in the compressional component, moving like this, the compression wave down the slinky, then that allows those compression waves to converge symmetrically at core, creating implosive, non-destructive compression. And that's called phase conjugation, healing, rejuvenation, implosion, zero-point energy access. You've got to get your longitudinal waves arriving like this, which is why when phase conjugation was first measured in optics, it was named four-wave mixing. So there's lots, you can always play 100 animations on the internet. You know, the ocean wave is moving along, okay? And some of that wave is going up and down, transverse, and some of that wave is going back and forth. And the amount of that wave going up and down versus back and forth is the difference between the longitudinal and the transverse. For example, when the tsunami arrives at the coastline here, oh, here's this my little laser. Let's see if the little laser device is going to work for me. Here, I want to point it. Oh, yeah, okay. So this is the coastline here, okay? There's the coast. Now, the tsunami is coming toward the coast at 600 miles per hour. And yet, if you're a boat on the surface, you don't even know it went underneath you. Why? Because most of that inertia is a longitudinal compressional wave. And so that'll go through just about anything on the surface of the ocean. You don't even know it went by. Like a longitudinal wave. Good metaphor. But when it arrives at the coastline, then the inertia, which was transverse going up and down here, is converted by going up the cone of the coastline, and then it becomes an up and down wave, the transverse. And that is heat containing and wipes out the coastline. Well, the metaphor is helpful because we need to understand how if you cross these longitudinal waves, which will go through just about anything, a Faraday cage, very easily, and you cross them at a distance, accurately, in a high dielectric constant of phase conjugate material, they will resynthesize the transverse component and therefore store heat at a distance. The only possible holy grail of fusion research, because obviously if you got to store all that heat at a distance, if you don't understand longitudinal microwave interferometry, you don't have a prayer in your fusion research lab. So if you want to store heat at a distance, like Ingo Swann did with his mind, you need to understand this. So, specifically, As Bearden explains in great length, and I have graphed here, but I am in the footsteps of Bearden, in this case Tom Bearden, who I worked with for many years as well, that the traverse of the up and down wave here, as it arrives here at this cone, the perfected vortex, for example, hydrogen radii, if they're lined up well, the up and down inertia moves up and down this perfected golden ratio caduceus, which is the same as that antenna on that radio frequency, that the inertia is translated and emerged here as longitudinal, even though it entered as transverse. So that conversion back and forth from longitudinal to transverse requires a perfected vortex pine cone, the pine cone kissing noses. And this dimension here is Planck. And that's the relief valve that releases the charge inertia through the speed of light into longitudinal waves named the gravity. So that resultant compressional wave is also why gravity waves are faster than light, et cetera, et cetera. And this is why phase conjugation in nonlinear optics was first named for wave mixing. You need the lasers in precisely symmetric opposing pairs. And you can start here with magnets to phase conjugate and make gravity, but ultimately the 612 symmetries work as well. And then finally the penteca, but it starts with tetracubic. It has to do with how the tetracube, which is in the center here, and unfortunately you can't see it, it's too little, but then you embed the tetracube in the dodecaecosa, and you go from the 7-spin tetraecosa to the 5-spin dodecaecosa. The 7-spin symmetry tetracube is embedded in the 5-spin symmetry dodecaecosa, and that's why all of the occult chemistry clairvoyant visions of the Anu, the heart of the sun, the heart of the human, and the heart of the hydrogen all had 7 spins outside and 5 spins inside. Perfect embedding. So the point is here, the metaphor would be that the miraculous substance, which is the phase conjugate mirror, barium strontium titanate or lithium niobate, the secret to what was in the bottom of Nostradamus' scrying cup, or the secret to what was in the show stone of John Dee, or the secret of what was in the powder, the ground up glass meteorite, gold-doped Kaaba stone of the Muslim, which became the red powder with which Dee and Kelly made the purest gold ever measured by the British Royal Society, is called a phase conjugate dielectric. And that is the substance of the material that needs to be right here in the center to make a phase conjugate mirror work. So the geometry is essentially this cascade, 0.618, 0.618, 1.618, this 2.6. This golden mean ratio progression is infinite in both directions. Add any two number, you get the following. Multiply any number by 1.618, and you get the next number, like 1.618 squared is 2.618. This is called recursive heterodyning perfected. And so I'm going to show you in a minute, we wrote the equations to prove that this and only this is the solution in general to constructive wave interference, and therefore the solution in general to compression, and therefore the solution in general to gravity. And we published those equations. So that resulted in my new equation, which is the origin of biologic negentropy. The origin of negentropy in general, the title of my book. And this slide is on the front cover, is on the inside cover in color. And it says, and remember how simple this is. I took Planck, and then I multiplied by golden ratio, and then I was done. So I will allow no one to tell me this was complicated. No. Golden ratio, by definition, is embedding perfected, recursion perfected, self-similarity perfected, and therefore fractality perfected. So many physicists already agreed that fractality causes gravity. Here is the proof. So you take Planck, length or time, multiply by exact integer exponents of golden ratio, and you get 3 exact hydrogen radii. You get exactly the wavelength of the most important molecule in the body, adenosine diphosphate to triphosphate, 1.91 angstroms. Planck length times gold ratio to 1.5. You get the only 2 exact frequency peaks which cause photosynthesis to happen. It's a phase conjugate negentropic charge implosive phenomenon. You get the British foot, the definition of the sacred. You get the Schumann harmonics, the brainwave harmonics. You get the LF Mayer wave, the most important frequency of the blood, 0.9 hertz. I'm sorry. 0.1 hertz, 0.09. You get the Venus year, Earth year, galactic year, and precessional year, all almost exactly.
What is that called? That is called a line that enables charge implosion and allows all those systems to emerge from chaos. And that is the origin of negentropy. And that is my discovery. So this is the publication we did, and here's the web link at the Journal of Science. We took the Klein-Gordon wave equations and proved by generalized wave equations, first, that golden ratio solves the problem of maximum constructed wave interference on a line. And then we took this model, which we now know is an accurate model of hydrogen. It's called our star mother kit, golden mean.info/kit, and we sell hundreds of these. Infinite, three-dimensional, the only possible three-dimensional fractal, dodeca, ecosa, dodeca. The tetra is the opposite of fractals because the opposite is compressible. And the XYZ coordinate value of every node in that infinite nest is a simple multiple of golden ratio. A whole number. So basically, once you know that golden ratio in a line is constructive interference, then that line and each of the axes of symmetry is the nodal array of the cause of the existence of hydrogen and the reason hydrogen is able to make gravity. So this is sort of an introduction, and then to Tom Bearden, who is talking at length about the matrix algebra, proving that longitudinal wave generation by phase conjugation is gravity waves, and the only way to create fertility, biology, self-organization, and living structures. And I highly recommend Gravitobiology by Bearden, but there's some math in there. And we electrical engineers sometimes aren't in love with math. So, symptoms of Einstein-induced insanity. Our next slide. Look, no one is here to belittle the fabulous contribution that Einstein and Tesla made, but I have a slide for both that describes their limitations, which I have bumped into, which I find immensely disturbing, and I wish to point them out. Okay, first of all, not having a clue why objects fall to the ground. That's a limitation. 2, thinking the speed of light is a speed limit. Oops, no. Velocities faster than light are routinely measured, and now they said that we know around golden ratio times the speed of light, proof of the conjugate law causes gravity. Thinking it takes infinite energy to go through the speed of light. No, you go through the speed of light every time you conjugate and make a longitudinal wave. Thinking all action at a distance is spooky. Only so if you don't know how to interfere longitudinal waves at a distance and recreate heat-containing transverse. For example, the physics of stargates and portals is all about longitudinal interferometry. Also, radar projection also. Remember, the Russians got the conjugate scientists from the Germans. The Americans got the rocket scientists. You know who got the worst end of the deal? Not having a clue that the ether, what it's made of, it's a compressible superfluid whose compression rarefaction is charged. This mistake reflects schizophrenia rampant without a real unified field science, ridiculously somehow believing that gravity and electromagnetism were made of a different substance. That is a dangerous schizophrenic disease, in my opinion. Okay, incorrectly and weirdly believing space-time is somehow bent, instead of clearly understanding precisely that what is bent by gravity is a compressible wave front trajectory. Not understanding that both mass and time are created and defined simply by the inertia and period of charge rotation. So the change of clock speed, etc., we just talked about that. Tesla's mistakes. Don't want to pick on the poor guy. Wonderful contribution. Obviously, he got the AC thing right. DC was a mistake, right? But choosing 60 hertz for motors, power distribution, when in fact 50 hertz, if you do the equations, 50 hertz is a sacred frequency. It is the most common mentioned frequency for healing cancer in all of the medical literature. And oh, by the way, if you want to make super pure carbon nano, guess where you can never do it? Hint, USA, you're screwed, is in a 60-cycle environment. We have a carbon nano team, and I can tell you they know this by experience. So obviously, you need sacred frequencies which are embeddable in order to create negentropy, and here Tesla made a huge mistake. 2, not implementing the physics of longitudinal interferometry. In other words, remember all those famous pictures of the light bulbs that are out on the lawn, and Tesla Tower is transmitting, and he calls it energy without wires at a distance. Well, guess what? that is never going to work efficiently until you know where to put the light bulbs. And just like Bruce Cathy measured, if you don't know where to find where the magnetic grid lines cross and embed longitudinal, you don't have a prayer of energy transmission without wires. Okay? So longitudinal interferometry is the only possible physics of energy transmission. So everybody's talking about free energy and we got cheated for energy without wires because Tesla died. No! He didn't get it right. Not understanding longitudinal EMF waves are gravity waves. See also Tom Beer, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So efficient plasma containment to contain the heat of fusion will only be discovered using centripetal longitudinal interferometry. The centripetal force is always due to phase conjugation to longitudinal distribution release, accurately tuned by golden ratio, recursive heterodynes locked to Planck threshold. That is the symmetry required for plasma containment and energy transmission at a distance. And an example. I don't know if Mr. Schauberger is here today. Huh, glad. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Okay. Let's call this Schauberger's dream. Okay, where you pick up the voltage. Remember, here is Mr. Schauberger, although in the one in Jonathan and Dolly's implosion research lab in Plymouth, UK, the container was coated with silver, sometimes palladium is used, and they used a 50,000 RPM flat impeller here. And the voltage, and remember, the water must be piezoelectrically doped, which is to say a little bit of quartz powders, that kind of thing. So make the vortex piezoelectric. For example, our implosion technologies, they work most powerfully when the water has a bit of a mineral because it makes it piezoelectric. And then the plant growing next to the vortex grows faster even if it doesn't get the water because of implosive charge. So the charge implosion here is measured. The access to the power output is from the centripetal point here to the centrifugal point here, and you can guess which is which polarity. Okay? Centripetal, centrifugal, hint, hint. Now, in Jonathan and Dolly's case, after this thing started glowing blue and you plant it in the middle of a field, suddenly all the water in the field for tens of meters around starts being purified just by the presence of the device. And you need to understand exactly the physics of why. That physics is the fact that once the charge is capacitively imploded, the charge waves that travel through the implosion point at Planck, the pinecone point, are sorted into phase. If you're going to have a fight in an Irish pub and compression is exchanged, afterward everyone says sorted. So the sorting process happens where the compression is maximal. And that's implosive. Now, the thing that you need to understand, if, for example, you'd like to know why the Nazi Bell and the Vamana and the Hannibal flew, you need to understand why, in that case it was a mercury vortex doped with an iron powder, the famous red liquid. But you need to understand why, on the path of the spiral on that torus, there was an experience of acceleration of charge due to the proper trajectory. So why did that wave speed up inherently on that path towards center? What caused it to accelerate going towards center? Do you know? If you do, you know the origin of negative entropy, zero-point energy, and gravity, and life force, and mind. If you don't know any of those things. So you must know what caused that wave to accelerate on that path curve on the spiral on the torus. You must know. It's implosive acceleration of charge due to perfected heterodyning of phase velocities. I'll show you a picture in a moment. So, example of that. Thanks to Valerie, we spent a lot of time in Joe Sell's living room in Lismore, outside of Byron Bay, where we live. Where all my projects are based in Australia. Spent a little time in France. I'm a visitor here. I live in Australia, where my businesses are there. So in Australia, there we are with Joe Sell, and he's explaining to us. He explained beautifully his model of magnetic fields as octahedral, and he's right, because that's how magnetism phase conjugates. But you actually need to know the direction in which these metal tubes were extruded when they were made to have the capacitance be implosive. So implosive capacitance is a name for everything we're speaking of today, including why the Ark of the Covenant reduces radioactivity. Implosive capacitance. So the symmetry of these needs to be up. Now we know why it works, okay? We could tune these pipes now. We know the scale and the ratio. We could correct the length and the radii by equation, my equation, to make these more efficient. But just to give you an example, what you need to know in order to understand this. Step one, when the hydrogen, we call it water gas. I agree with that term. Instead of calling it magna gas and Joe cell gas and Brown's gas and water gas, we had a lot of names for it. But when that living plasma emerged, it was self-organizing. It traveled like a worm that had a mind. And what Joe said, and he's right, you had to, quote unquote, condition the space. And that's true around Therify.net. That's true under a working Schauberger vortex implosion. What does it mean by conditioning the space? In order to help you think about that, I'll tell you one observed phenomena, and we were there. Thank you, Noah and the Byron New Energy Group. You are driving along, your implosive Joe cell is spitting out your water gas, and your car's driving along fine. But if you should happen to stop over a railroad track, it would quit. Does anyone here know why? Well, resonance is everything, so it's also nothing. Well, remember, the steel has the wrong dielectric constant. That's the short answer. The steel shorts out the magnetic field. If you want to kill the elementals in your neighborhood, run a railroad track through. You know where John Trithemius floated and melted the coffin lid, later named the Holy Grail, was in the burial ground at Arles, where for 300 years everyone needed to be buried thereafter. Then the town put a railroad track through, and guess what happened? It died. So that railroad track, the steel, has the opposite dielectric constant. There's a very technical word for that in electrical engineering, which basically is to kill or quench. So you get the feel. So this is why you need high dielectric constant, which is basically capacitive efficiency. Easy way to think about that. That's why you feel great in a house made of wood, and you feel like merde in a house made of steel. The reason is because your aura can couple the high dielectric constant of biological material, the definition of biological architecture. Whereas in steel or aluminum, you put your hand on steel or aluminum and you feel your aura die. That is an example of a deathly dielectric constant. So that prevents the conditioning of the space. It's also required, for example, for successful death. And we'll describe some slides on that. So if I animate that spin path, you see what I mean by the Holy Grail. I'm only animating that golden ratio on the spiral by equation and rotating in 3D, which incidentally is a trajectory into the hydrogen bond in your DNA, literally. And it's a cup within a cup, it's a Holy Grail, and a flame that does not consume, and if you drink of this, you will live forever. And they're right. And you can zoom in forever and always see the same thing recursively, infinitely. So here's golden ratio on the Mandelbrot set. You see the real physics of even Mandelbrot is actually golden ratio, perfected compression. Mathematicians knew that fractals were the solution of compression. The electrical engineers haven't caught up yet, but they need to. So if you animate that path, a sine wave graded by golden ratio embedded in dodecaecosine infinitely, you get the trajectory of implosive compression. Another animation, it's the worms. So it's the same equation that I then did the CAD-CAM and made perfected implosion. We named the technology theimploder.com. We call it Schauberger's dream in honor of. Thank you. And so this is an example. We market this kit called the Star Mother Kit to make the infinite mess of dodecaecosa, which is, we now know, the actual geometry of hydrogen. And you see, on the top center, that's the caduceus cone there. But note, the definition of scale invariance is only enabled by the dodeca because it can change scale without changing ratio non-destructively. The perfect imploding soap bubble has to be dodecaecosa. And that is the only possible non-destructive collapse of the wave function. So this is my original equation for the 3 hydrogen radii. The ionized hydrogen radii from Dan Winter's equation. I thank Mark Rohrbar for help in the graphic display. Planck times golden ratio of 116, 117, 118 power predicted exactly with incredible precision the 3 hydrogen radii. So that is a map of the geometry of hydrogen, which newly now is proven fractal by my new equation. So science agrees the symmetry of the mass of the universe, maybe in honor of Paul LaViolette here, they said, oh, Nature magazine has announced officially that the universe is dodeca. We're going to see later it's because it's the arrangement of the masses of the local universe anyway. But at the same time, right on the time, New Scientist magazine comes out and says, oh, the universe is fractal. Well, they didn't know that the dodecastellation is the perfect fractal. And that's the only way to stabilize gravity. Now, we're going to talk about that a little bit in terms of when Hodewanick and Ramsey, who were good friends of mine, particularly Bill Ramsey, they used a 25-cent capacitor, and they measured gravity waves a lot more efficiently than Weber's billion-dollar gravity or LIGO, actually. And the phase velocities were faster than light. And it's simple that the capacitive coupling, when it's conjugate, when there's a ray which is conjugate, capacitors couple gravity waves beautifully, now that we know that gravity waves are longitudinal waves. And that is the physics behind the Josephson junction at the core of the Princeton life force detector, the Princeton anomaly detector. So the universe is dodeca, the universe is fractal, and the alchemy access to black hole making is because that perfect 3 fractality is the only way to stabilize gravity. And that work was based on this idea that we made a map of the known local masses. And I'm totally in agreement with Paul that now that we know the cause of gravity, we also know why there's more gravity than they can account for, which dumps into the trash can, agreeing with Paul LaViolette, the idea of dark matter. It's a crappy idea. It's not right. So once you know the cause of gravity and why the extra gravity is hanging around, the idea of dark matter is another part of the local insanity. So these are other physicists who have agreed that fractality is the cause of gravity. El Nashi, Andre Lin, Lee and Coxeter's work, that fractality is in fact the cause of gravity, but we're the first to write the equations, at least the ones that showed golden ratio perfects compression, which defines, perfected compression defines gravity making. And this is a reference to Mohammed El Nashi's work on golden ratio in physics, and there's 100 papers. I like to talk about this just so that you could see. Here's an example. If you happen to know why objects fall to the ground, then the EM drive, remember what the EM drive was, it's been tested at NASA, it makes a little bit of gravity. All you got is microwave bouncing inside a trapezoid. But now if you know why gravity is caused, you know that you could align those peaks by equation to make them a more accurate phase conjugate caduceus imploding at Planck. And you could increase the gravity output efficiently by knowing why an object falls to the ground. Hello, NASA, are you out there? And so this is the top-down view that I hope you can follow me on this one. So when the waves align this way, this is the top-down view of hydrogen, DNA, Earth grid, and the masses of the universe, and every living protein. Okay, that's a top-down view by equation. And now, since that's all based on golden ratio, when wavelength A meets wavelength B converging like this, not only do the waves add and multiply recursively, constructively, only because of golden ratio, they add and multiply constructively not only their wavelength and frequency, but they also add and multiply constructively their phase velocity. That is the reason gravity exists. That is the reason all centripetal forces exist. That is the reason a spiral on the torus, for example, the Mercury vortex in the Nazi Bell Vimana Hanabu, flew, because that trajectory produces, when the symmetry of compression is correct, that form of compression produces acceleration of charge at center, named the gravity. And the reason the golden ratio is the only way to make that work, named gravity or mindfulness or negentropy or implosion, is because the wave phase velocities also add and multiply recursively, so the charge wavefront, a portion of its inertia, experiences acceleration of charge resulting from compression of charge. So only that form of compression generates acceleration at center, named the gravity. This is more on the history of measurements of golden ratio in hydrogen, and it's true. I stand on the shoulders of Hejrowska, who did dozens of equations of golden ratio in hydrogen structure, for example, between electron shells. My addition and contribution to that work was specifically that I was the first to show that golden ratio also was the radii from Planck. So he said between between shells you got golden ratio. I said also distance to center at Planck threshold is also golden ratio. That was my new contribution to that extensive work that had already been done on the golden ratio and the structure of hydrogen. So Hejrowska did wonderful work. I added one little piece that if you extend these lines to center, to Planck, suddenly you get golden ratio also. So recursive adding and multiplying heterodyning both wavelength and phase velocity create cohering of wavefront speeds through the speed of light. This opens a drain hole for charge to move out, producing the phenomenon named gravity. Thus capacitance, implosive charge. In the symmetry of self-similar fractality is how gravity is created, because this successful heterodynamic wave produces acceleration of perfected compression. So that's just a summary. And many pictures have been discussing this for many years. The spiral on the cone, pine cones kissing noses. In the Steiner work, the breathing, opening and closing of the seeds of a pine cone over the ear to adjust the amount of voltage the pine cone gets from gravity. Very fun. And Kepler was actually right. Recursive nested embedding is how you stabilize gravity. He got it correctly. Because you take that tetracube and you embed it in dodecaecosa and you get the cause of gravity. What he didn't know was the only way to do that is golden mean ratio. The ratio of the edge length of the cube to the dodecaecosa, for example. So perfected nesting embedding, Kepler's intuition was correct. Also, this is what I mentioned earlier, that, where did I put the pointer? Doesn't matter. So we had 7 spins on the outside, 5 spins on the inside. Remember, when the clairvoyant Leadbeater and Besant detected this symmetry in the heart of the sun, in the heart of the human, and the heart of hydrogen, the 7 spins inside, 5 spins outside, this is the cause of the structure of the human heart muscle in 7 layers, exactly the axial tilt angle of the symmetry axes of the tetrahedron. Stellated tetra, cube octa. Compress, ecosa. Compress further, octa. Compress further, tetra. I learned that personally from Bucky Fuller. I want to thank you. So there's 7 symmetry axes that traverse. It has more symmetry than any structure in the universe, and that is a cause and the reason for the structure of the human heart muscle, the anu, the human heart, and the heart of hydrogen, the heart of the sun. Those 7 spin symmetric arrows. And later when we animate the physics of the origin of Hebrew and Sanskrit letters, we use that same symmetry index. So those 7 spins outside, 5 spins inside. What actually those occult chemistry clairvoyant, they call it micro-psi clairvoyant. Later in the book Psi Perception of Quarks, they proved that they knew long time before the subatomic chemistry, and that actually occult chemistry presaged modern chemistry of subatomic structures. That's Phillips' work, Psi Perception of Quarks, proving the clairvoyants got it right. The anu, and you had a picture of the anu there that was wonderful. This is perfected embedding. Wanted to tell this story. See, the argument about whether the ether vacuum is compressible or not. Oh, here's my little. Okay. Normally, the vacuum is a compressible superfluid named charge. However, the nodes where the energy lines cross in a fractal called conjugate, which is why hydrogen is born, when they line up and they touch each other, it's like these billiard balls. When the billiard balls touch each other, then if you lift it up here and bounce, then a billion billiard balls down the way, one ball will bounce off almost immediately. Almost faster than light, question mark. Because there was stillness in the array because they were phase locked in this geometry, dodecaecosa, the geometry of the universe and hydrogen, and longitudinal grid in general, which is charge distribution efficiency. However, if those balls are separated even slightly, then the transmission of inertia will not be efficient. So basically, that crystalline-like stillness is what enables the slightest quiver. You're there meditating and you're having bliss, and a pin drops half a mile away and you hear it clearly. That crystalline geometry is charge distribution efficiency, a three-dimensional fractal. Too many slides, too little time. So, we took, and we synthesized, remember I said we did the equation, prove golden ratio, maximize construct interference. Here, we took a large number of mathematical waves and interfered them at all different ratios. And golden mean ratio produced the maximum surviving inertia. So maximum constructive interference by golden ratio was also proven by simply modeling a mathematical series without even the Gordon-Klein equations. However, when you nest those same waves by the octave, you produce maximum destructive interference. Octave harmonics, powers of 2, is actually maximum destructive interference. That makes you think that modern day music may be a mistake. Well, actually, the truth is that nature uses tetracubic structures, which make octaves right here, for isolating charge for that reason. Whereas nature uses pentadodeca structures like DNA and every living protein for distributing charge. So my friend Bucky Fuller's, who introduced me to Bucky Fuller, Gus Giacacci, his house was one ladder rung of DNA, and in the hex, in the cubic part of the house, is perfect for secrets. And in the pent part of the house, it's perfect for distribution. It's the physics of architecture, but also biology. And here's just an example of Nassim Harameins. And Elizabeth Rauscher tells us she did this math for Nassim, but either way, he plotted Big Bang, which is Planck, and the atom diameter, and the solar system diameter, and galaxy diameter, and universe diameter, and plotted frequency versus radius, and he got this. Golden ratio, golden ratio, golden ratio, golden ratio. Okay? So he was on his way to proving the black hole to Planck as well. And this is also dedicated to Mr. Schauberger. We want to know, when you put those devices to put a braid on a river, how do you accurately calculate the long wave with respect to the shorter wave to make that river implosively negatropic? And this is the answer to your that question, which is how you braid DNA. So, we skipped ahead a slide. Oh, I see. We're animating. So, here's DNA is a dodeca ratchet down a helix slinky. That's old news from Coxeter. And that double helix of DNA is actually a braided dodeca. But then if you thread the braid of the braid on the braid, the answer lies folded in an envelope. That's the envelope it's folded in. And the ratio of the long wave to short wave is the phase coherence of the braid, called perfect embedding or perfect nesting here. And in DNA, that braid of the braid of the braid on the braid is done 7 times until the DNA is actually toroidal and the plot thickens. So, but the ratio of the long wave to the short wave that does that braid imploding to DNA, which is the real programmer of DNA because it aligns the active sites, we have measured is actually induced by heart coherence. Here. So Glenn Ryan did this study at my request. At the onset of the moment of love, you get this harmonic series of coherence in the EKG. This plot is from the Heart Math Institute, EKG to DNA, and Glenn Ryan, at my suggestion, did this study, and sure enough, DNA braid density, the enzyme responsible for braiding in DNA, goes up dramatically in DNA in the presence of coherent EKG. The coherent phonon is actually the braid mechanism. So that braid and braid embedding is that's implosion of DNA, the thread on the thread here, and that's knot theory in the Celtic knot. And that's, if you ever watch a shaman steering a tornado in South America, and then you ask the shaman, how did you steer that tornado? He said, I'm eating the hoocha, which is to say I'm feeling the pain. I'm eating the anger. Well, actually, you would see if you had some clairvoyance and saw the bioplasmic streamers leaving the belly of the shaman, you would see that there was a nest embedding of the plasma of his aura into the centripetal center of that tornado, literally the eyeball. So that embedding or nestedness is literally the physics of steering tornado. And in fact, if all of physics is string theory of wormholes, everything a tornado is ever made of, this is called super looping, perfect nesting, and is why heart rate variability, harmonic inclusiveness is the fastest way to measure immune health. And when it recursively pilastrates and turns inside out, that braiding produces circular DNA, and there's a paper on that, toroidal DNA, and that donut. This is our work on, remember the many videos on the web of John Canzius. A glass of cold water is burning beautifully, and the only thing he's radiating is a circularly polarized spiral antenna, RF, causing the water to burn beautifully. And now we know why, because the frequency he used fit my equation. So we set up a lab to do that hydrolysis by implosion in Australia, and running out of time here, but I have a bunch of pictures of what we did in Australia. These are some of the hydrolysis cells we used. This is the lab, the equipment, the spectrum analyzer, the signal generator, and this is one of our hydrolysis machines, all done by the critical frequency to implode hydrogen, hydrolysis by Canzius, implosive capacitance. This is the wave collapse measured on the oscilloscope of the appropriate trigger wave, and this is the conjugate